Yes, I know. A very good morning to all of you. May I request Finance Secretary Mr. Arvind Mayaram to come and join me. And may I also request all of you to shift forward, please. Because after all, this is an academic institution. So, very good morning once again, and a very warm welcome to all of you, especially to Finance Secretary, Mr. Arvind Mayaram. Some of you have traveled long distances to be with us here for this 6th annual G20 conference, which has become a very important part of our calendar at ICRIER. G20 has become a premier international forum for discussing economic issues. Its importance can be gauged from the fact that it accounts for 85% of global GDP, more than 75% of global trade, and touches the lives of about 2/3 of the world's population. As before, ICRIER brings together academics and key policymakers from G20 member countries and international financial institutions to deliberate on a range of issues of common interest. The earlier conferences in this series have produced material that has been widely circulated among international financial institutions, think tanks, and government officials, both in India and abroad. The proceedings of the first 3 conferences served as inputs to policymakers participating in the summits. Then we became more ambitious, and we decided to put these papers together in volumes which will have greater outreach. So the 4th conference in 2012 resulted in a book published by Springer, and the 5th conference volume is also in the process of being published. This year, as you know, Australia is the group's president, and we are very happy indeed that the Australian government is one of the sponsors of this conference, along with the World Bank and CAS. In particular, we thank Barry Sterland, Australia's finance deputy, who is with us at this conference to share his insights with us. The issues dominating the summit's agenda are financial sector regulation, trade facilitation measures, protectionism, infrastructure investment, and tax policy coordination. All of these will be discussed in the course of this conference. Montek Ahluwalia, former G20 Sherpa from India and a founder member of ICRIER, shared with us his insights and his expectations from G20 at a pre-conference dinner last evening. We now have with us Mr. Arvind Mayaram, Finance Secretary from the Ministry of Finance, to give us his perspectives on how he sees the G20 process moving forward. As a crisis response body, the G20 delivered on its commitment of strong international cooperation to ensure greater policy coherence and helped overcome a situation that could have been a lot worse. There has been a shift in focus from crisis management to addressing collective well-being. As a body that is now attempting to coordinate structural reform process across a set of diverse countries, the G20 has an unenviable and complex task. Expectations are high, partly because of its earlier successes. Conferences like this one that bring together academics, think tanks, policymakers, and representatives of international financial institutions provide an opportunity to discuss complex and contentious issues and build knowledge base for better and more informed decisions. With these few words, I now invite Mr. Mayaram to come and share with us his ideas and thoughts on the G20 agenda, taking it forward. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ahluwalia, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege for me to be here today as part of this International Conference on Governance and Development, views from G20 countries. ICRIER has played a leading role in knowledge creation and shaping of opinion in leading global issues, and its contribution also to providing inputs to the thinking for G20 agenda have been commendable. I would like to congratulate the organizers for bringing together this eminent gathering to dwell upon some of the issues that we believe are of great importance for deliberation in the G20. The global financial and economic crisis of 2008-9 is a historic event that marks a turning point for the entire world. It has been one of the greatest assaults on global economic stability to have occurred in 3/4 of a century. And it has exposed the fragility of international financial and economic institutions and the limitations of existing macroeconomic policy cooperation. Therefore, in the wake of the global crisis, G20 countries were called upon to further strengthen international cooperation and bring together systemically important advanced and emerging economies to discuss key issues in the global governance and economic development. Given its crisis track record, expectations from the G20 forum are also growing, especially since its intervention is widely perceived to have prevented the current global crisis escalating into another Great Depression. However, much of its success has been achieved in crisis situations where consensus is much easier, and it has been increasingly doubtful that the G20 is equally effective in resolving contentious issues in normal times. Two major weaknesses have been quoted many times, and these are its failure to significantly reform governance of the international financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, and the loose policy coordination in the post-crisis period for strong, sustainable, and balanced global development. If the G20 continue to fail on these counts, credibility of the formation is seriously at stake. Globalization has brought several benefits and synergies in growth and development across the globe. However, to reap the benefits, Credible international economic cooperation is necessary in today's world. An integrated world economy requires strong cooperation among major economic powers such as the G20. Without determined cooperation among the principal powers, globalization is unlikely to survive the inevitable periodical shocks to which it is subjected. The macroeconomic cooperation within G20 has been a success because of strong coordinated policy response. However, over the years, this stellar achievement has been somewhat tarnished by the fact that the global economic recovery, particularly in advanced economies, has still been very weak, and the global economy has witnessed major downturn in the last couple of years. These prolonged downturn in major economies resulted in mounting public deficits and debt, necessitating the central banks to assume a growing share of the burden for driving the recovery. The resultant surge in liquidity and more recently tapering made emerging market economies' exchange rates extremely volatile and threatened their quick recovery from the crisis. But the G20 policy coordination in this juncture to mitigate global spillovers has remained extremely weak. I understand that this topic will be discussed in the first session of this conference. We are all aware how ineffective the G20 process is regarding reforms of the international financial institutions, including the IMF and the World Bank. Agreement for the IMF reforms in 2010 has not yet been achieved, and the G20 could not be persuaded to ask its members to ratify it. Moreover, even though the G20 members as a group keep emphasizing on the existing huge gap of financing for investment in infrastructure to steer the much needed growth and development in emerging and developing economies, institutions like the World Bank have not yet been able to play any significant role to increase availability of financing for infrastructure investment. There is a growing feeling that the asymmetric architecture of global economic decision making is loaded heavily in favor of the developed countries and against the emerging market economies. One stark example of this is when the crisis hit Eurozone, the G20 led the efforts and created a firewall in the IMF of $500 billion, in which even countries like India contributed, to provide a wall to prevent collapse of the European economies. But when the emerging market economies are facing problems now, the general refrain is that these countries should put their house in order. And there is very little overt effort to show that there is a global concern and a global effort to provide necessary assistance to the emerging market economies. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand you will discuss these issues over the 2 days. We have been having these discussions, and I would like to put on record our appreciation of the efforts being made by the current presidency of the G20, the Government of Australia. They have made efforts to balance the issues. They are still making efforts to bring much of the concerns of all the members, which includes the emerging economies, to the table. And I really wish them luck that they would be able to find some success in the present situation, which doesn't seem to be very encouraging for the moment. I would urge all of you to look at these issues in totality, and perhaps the deliberations which are being held in this conference will provide a new insight into the issues and the manner in which G20 perhaps could look at them. Thank you very much for inviting me for this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayaram. Now, we do have a few minutes, and if, we are known for spontaneous interventions in conferences like this. So, Barry, if I may I request you to share some general thoughts? Maybe if you could speak for 10 minutes, because Mr. Mayaram is not going to be with us later in the day. And of course, we will be sending the proceedings to him, but it would be very nice if we can have you speak at this stage. Please. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahluwalia. And thank you, Arvind, for those challenging words, and I think you've set out some of the challenges very well. We've very much appreciated our involvement in the ICRIER conferences over the years. I think we've been able to be at most of them and contribute to them. I think it's an important intellectual bond between our countries to attend these events and build understanding of each other's circumstances. I'm going to focus mainly on the implications of the Australian and the G20 agenda for this year on emerging economies. And I suppose, I think all G20 members, whatever their level of development, have a lot to gain from success this year. Our view is that the G20 is the right forum to deal with 21st century issues of economic cooperation and governance. We know how the sizes of the economies involved. Its membership's broad enough to be relevant, narrow enough to be effective, and I think its informal structure allows both flexibility and frankness in discussion. And I think Australia, like India, have huge national interests involved in the success of the G20. I think it provides a mechanism for us to understand and shape spillovers on our economy. It enables us to be part of the development of key international standards. And I think a little known or a little appreciated part of the G20 is that it, for Australia at least, it contains all our key bilateral partners. And it enables us to progress those relationships. And I believe sitting around the table has deepened those relationships, including with India. What we've tried to do this year is focus the agenda. We've wanted to have two key themes, growth and economic resilience. Now, they're not new to the G20 by any means, but in a sense, I think the agenda had become large and unwieldy and moved away from that comparative advantage. And I think that was reducing the effectiveness of the body. 5 years after the crisis, there's a need for decisive progress on both these fronts. And I think that requires the full attention of the G20 from leaders down. So the global economy continues to deal with the legacy issues from the financial crisis that unfolded 6 years ago. But at the same time, we need to focus on issues of the future, and so we're looking to secure new sources of strong, sustainable and balanced growth. And we need to deal with new issues like tax cooperation. At their Sydney meeting, the finance ministers and central bank governors committed to work together to shift the dial on growth by committing to undertake policy actions to boost their collective GDP by more than 2% by 2018. That number was based on work from international organisations suggesting that this objective was within our reach, with ambitious but realistic policies. We were focusing particularly on policies to increase the quantity and quality of infrastructure investment, increase domestic competition, facilitate trade, and policies to improve the way our labour markets function, and particularly to increase the economic participation of vulnerable groups. I'll just say a few words about why we believe that's the right response to current challenges. I think the first one's obvious, and that's that the recovery remains weak. And we've struggled to generate a self-sustaining recovery. There's been some positive signs in some key advanced economies like the US, but in others, the data's decidedly mixed. There's been a marked slowdown in growth in some emerging market economies due to both cyclical and structural factors. And as a result of all that, the world economy is operating at well below its potential. Compared to where global output might have been if the pre-crisis trend had continued, some estimates would put that global output gap as large as 8%. And even allowing for some of those excesses in the pre-crisis period, there's no doubt that there's very significant unused capacity. This has a human cost. Unemployment's high, and the development aspirations of emerging and developing economies are not being met. And so that's why it's really important that we make up that lost ground. And that reason alone, I think, would be a justification for the concerted action that we've been talking about this year. By reforming together, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We all benefit from positive spillovers. Up to a third of that 2% came from the combined spillover effects from concerted action. That sort of those spillovers, along with the sort of common purpose that flows from unified international effort, can help with the difficult task of achieving those reforms. I think so. Those considerations would suggest some ambition in this area is appropriate. But I think the macroeconomic conjuncture would suggest that the task of generating more sustained growth is even more urgent. We really need this to ensure a faster transition to more balanced and sustainable macroeconomic settings. In particular, I think we need to take the pressure off monetary policy to carry the recovery in key advanced economies. I know we're talking about that a bit more later this morning, but we've seen extraordinary reliance on monetary policy, and my own view is that that's been appropriate. But we also know that sustained low interest rates and extraordinary measures carry risks. They can't be fully mitigated by capital controls and other complementary measures. So that's why ministers and governors in Sydney agreed that concerted effort was important. It was the appropriate response both to that long-term issue of getting growth back up to potential, but also to responding to the current macroeconomic outlook. So I think that's sort of a bit of background on that 2% aspiration. I think we've all got a key interest in that. Australia as a capital importer, emerging economies as they handle and navigate the modern economy. And what we're finding this year, I think, is that many emerging economies, together with advanced economies, are recognising the centrality of such reforms to their own longer-term growth ambitions. We've heard words about middle-income traps and the need to develop the necessary structural policies to break through that middle-income barrier. And so many key emerging economies are in the process of implementing wide-ranging reforms, that, including in the areas that we were nominating for action. Indian authorities have done so, and that was emphasised in the recent budget. China and Mexico have also announced comprehensive reform programs. So as well as being the right economic response, there's been a real sense that it's struck a chord with the membership. So the mechanism for delivering on this will be the delivery of comprehensive growth strategies to the Leaders' Summit in Brisbane this year. We're looking for specific country policy commitments to which we can hold each other accountable. And taken together, the comprehensive growth strategies of G20 members is an opportunity to show that we mean business in shifting that dial of growth. One of the areas that we're really emphasising for action is the area of infrastructure investment. This is an agenda that chimes with all members at all levels of development, and I think it's got particular resonance in the Asian region, given the large infrastructure gaps there. Fundamentally, we need to operate on a number of different fronts. We need to operate on improving our own domestic investment environments, improving the quality of public investment, and opportunities for public and private collaboration. In the context of restoring our public finances, we also need to rebalance our fiscal spending away from current and towards capital expenditures. We know there's lots of private capital waiting for the right investment opportunities, and so we need to address key inhibitors such as regulatory conditions, financial lack of depth in financing markets and such. And we need to provide certainty. And so in addition to member actions to improve that investment environment, the G20 is working to develop a package of collective measures. These actions are essentially aimed at reducing the cost of infrastructure investment by improving the information available to markets and governments. We need to consolidate data on bankable projects and increase the pipeline of those projects. And so we're trying to develop a mechanism to deliver those benefits, and at the same time, I think as Arvind sort of emphasised, working with the World Bank and regional development banks to enhance their support for infrastructure. And so there's been, I think, some useful pressure coming out of the process. For various reasons, increased capital to those institutions is unlikely. So within that constraint, I think we've tried to push these institutions to make better use of their balance sheets and better coordinate that support, reduce the repetition and the like. But I think this investment agenda is shared across the G20. My own government's put enormous emphasis on that, and I know the Indian government's also doing that. So investment's one of the elements we need to generate growth. I think with fiscal policy reaching its limits, either politically or for economic reasons, public infrastructure is one area where I think you can get some G20 consensus to provide some much needed demand as well as increased productive capacity. Needs to be complemented by other actions, particularly in the labour market, in competition and in trade, to provide that growth. But I think that's in everyone's interests. At the same time as working on these structural policies, the bread and butter of the G20, always the first session when we meet, is really around macroeconomic cooperation. And I think we've made some strides this year on that. We're facing different issues than we did in the crisis. Then it was a synchronised shock. It required synchronised action. It's a much more complex world now. But I think we've made progress through the year. For the first time in February, the G20 acknowledged that monetary policy should be set in a way that's mindful of global impacts. At the same time, there was a common recognition across the G20 that the primary response to international fragilities was for G20 members to ensure domestic economic policy settings are sound, and we also reiterated the importance of global safety nets. They're simple enough sounding words, but for various reasons I think they would have been difficult to say even just a year ago. Their inclusion in public communication reflects a new, more cooperative tone within the G20 discussions on macroeconomic issues, which we hope to continue in Cairns. And of course, the whole effort on the comprehensive growth strategies is a form of macroeconomic cooperation. It's a response to those conditions. Now, growth has to go hand in hand with resilience, and in my written speech I'll say a bit more about that, but we are addressing those issues in later sessions, so I won't talk about it